Good morning and welcome to the new episode of Dr. Lamba's Awakening Call. You remember I talked about China being basically a paper tiger, economic paper tiger. It's great in technology, it's great in armies, military, but economically, what was presumed to be that's going to be number one economy in the world is no longer there. And the fault lines in Chinese economy are now clearly visible. What was not expected by many people, but which I was talking all the time, that it might be number two economy, and it would have been. But that's not going to happen. As a matter of fact, this is an opportune time for India to reap the benefits of the slowing down of Chinese economy, of the fault lines which are visible in the Chinese economy, exploit them. Exploit them to the maximum. Unfortunately, India is not doing that. And to be honest with you, the economic history of the world, especially of Asia, is being repeated. At one time, you remember, Japan used to be deemed the storehouse of technology, the country which economic growth was phenomenal. And then what happened? It went flat. The same is happening exactly in China. I would prefer to call it Japanification of China. In 1980s, if you remember, Japan was the prime threat to the US economic dominance. That was in 80s. And wherever you went, people would talk of Japanese technology, Japanese exports, quality. Now, there's a difference. While Japanese quality was world famed, the Chinese quality is not acceptable. But still, economically, what Japan was in the 80s is China today. But if you see the similarities, you would see what I talked about. The fault lines in the Japanese economy are now visible in the economy of China. China faces high level of debts, aging population, hostile USA, and what happened recently, even possible financial crisis. You remember China, and then immediately you think of Japan, a rapidly increasing economy that had grown wealthy through exports, high level of investment and debt, ballooning property market, and economic power threatening to overtake that of US. Exactly the same thing happened in China. I would say that as a matter of fact, the Chinese economy was much stronger than that of Japan. And the danger to USA would have been much more because Chinese were also militarily and, as I said, technologically strong. So what Japan in 80s was hailed to be an economic miracle and a primary threat to US supremacy. Its growth from 10% per year on average from 1960s onward, every year 10% growth, which was phenomenal and unbroken from 60s to 80s. 2 decades of 10% growth every year. And that was a compound growth. So it was an economic miracle and US was worried. The corporate icons like Toyota and Sony threatened to replace American counterparts like Ford and General Electric. And then, as I said earlier, it got burst, all went wrong. The massive asset bubble burst. What followed was an end to the miracle and a full-blown financial crisis that rocked Japan in the early 90s, leading to a lost decade and the economy flatlined. So, a word was coined at that time, Japanification. Japanification became a standard jargon for the brutal mix of stagnation and deflation that even today is not absent from Japan. Even today, Japan is suffering from stagnation. Even today, Japan is suffering from deflation, and it has not come to the level where it was. So these similarities between China and Japan do worry China. And as I said, they should excite India. Now let's look at the similarities in detail. Like Japan in the early 90s, 80s, China today is dealing with high level of debt. It has an aging population. It has a hostile USA. And the most recent real estate bubble has shown the signs of bursting of the bubble. The assumption that Chinese is going to overtake the US as the world's biggest economy is definitely not going to happen. What China was thinking even 4 months back, and most of us agreed with that 2021, 2022, China would be number 1, USA would be number 2, India would be number 3. But a slowdown in the Chinese economy is not in the interest of China. Maybe it's not in the interest of the world as well. Because if Chinese economy goes bust, it is going to have a domino effect on others. Forget about India. But the countries in Africa, in Middle East, and all the countries connected with BRI are going to suffer. Europe is going to suffer. Canada is going to suffer. America is going to suffer. Because the people all over have become dependent on Chinese goods. And as the inflation is already increasing, when the consumer goods are not available, when the food items are not available, for example, in Canada, when you go to the market, you get the garlic. It's not Canadian garlic, it's not Indian garlic, it's Chinese garlic. So that's going to affect. And do not forget that the Chinese today account for almost 30% of the global growth. So if 30% of the global growth is hampered, the whole world would hamper. And in the days of globalization, you cannot say it. So that's why I said this is a chance for India to jump into the gap. If India's manufacturing, India's agriculture output can replace China, then the Japanification of Chinese would not in fact be felt that much. And the world market would be happy to accept the good from India. Now, can India do it or not? You don't know. But one thing is sure, that China is suffering. Now, we are the world over worried because there are going to be 4 reasons for the China to lose. And that should also be a lesson to India because India can avoid those 4 reasons. First is big debt problem and fear of bubble busting. Japan's real estate bubble got so big in 1980s that till today the property prices of the country have not recovered from its popping. In India, as in Canada, property prices are going through the roof. So the result is that the corporate debt automatically skyrockets. And when the property prices, the real estate prices go up and corporate debts increase, then that's a recipe for disaster. So that happened in 90s in Japan. Fast forward to today. China has been gorging on debt for years. They didn't bother. They were under debt. And they wanted to power rapid growth. So they took debt right and left to increase the infrastructure, production capacity, exports, aid. So it was particularly in real estate sector. And the real estate sector in China counted for 30% of GDP. 30%. And when this burst came just now, so 30% of GDP is wiped out. The problem is, what happened? One of the biggest real estate developers in China, Evergrande, I had discussed about it, has defaulted on $300 billion of debt. $300 billion wiped off in one corporation. This is most heavy debt of any company in the world. But not only that, it is 2% of the China's GDP. Now, if your GDP is wiped out by 2%, you come down like a house of cards. And Evergrande might be indebted, but it's not the only one. That's the unfortunate part. Evergrande is just one of the many. And the looming implosion in Evergrande, against the background of China governments clamping down on debt and trying to rebalance the economy towards consumption-driven growth. Now that's a problem. Chinese growth has been consumption-driven. North America, the Europe, they consume goods and Chinese export. It is not production growth driven. And consumption driven growth cannot be rebalanced by debts. So the result would be China will slow its shift in the economic model. IMF experts think that the economy to be expanding at around 5% by 2025. It was 10% in 2010. So it comes down to 5%, reduction of 5%. India's economy, according to IMF, is likely to increase to 8.5% next year. And by 2025, 8% can become 10%, 12%. Depends on the capability of the Indian policies and the Indian entrepreneurs. Now, another interpretation is by the Atlantic Council. They think, no, IMF is wrong. Chinese economy would be increasing not by 5%, but by 3%. The 3% is as good as the growth of the Canadian economy. Coupled with that, the inflation of 6 to 7%. So it's not a growth of 3%, it's a loss of 3 to 4%. So there is a tremendous level of panic and stress in the Chinese financial system. And the result is the bonds and the property have crashed, making it more difficult for the biggest corporations in China to borrow because the bonds have crashed, there's no money available. Now the analysts hope that Beijing can keep a lid on the contagion. But look at what happened in COVID-19. Just as they tried to keep a hold, but ultimately in this age of information, you can't keep a hold on that. And market is way behind the reality. Now, the second part is the growing population. Again, referred to Japan's economy in 90s, suffered because of the rapidly aging population. Simply put, an aging population, a growing market, means there are fewer workers, but there are more users, consumers, and makes economic growth harder. Rising pension costs, rising welfare costs, rising health costs add to the pressure on public spending. China's working age population peaked in 2015 because of its one child policy. Sorry. Its huge population allowed the economy to suck workers into the cities. The people who come from the village to the cities because they needed workers. And the industrial boom needed more workers. What result? The agriculture suffered. And urbanization in China at the turn of the 2020s added to the supply of workers beginning, and then it slowed down because all were aging. They wanted to go back. Not that they have much work to do there, but they had no hope here. So Chinese demographic path resembles Japan's growth in a population-wise, demographic-wise, identical. So the demographic bump has gone off now. And the demographic problems also feed into worries about the debts. High level of investment looks less appropriate for a slow and aging economy. Aging population means aging economy. Let's look that way. Thirdly, the political reasons. The tensions with US are increasing. Japan surged up the economic league tables, and that was a shock to USA. Academic produced books like Japan as number one, Emerging Japanese Superstate, and Atlantic wrote an article, I remember. The article was titled Containing Japan. So US played tough with Japan, and now US is playing tougher with China. President Trump launched a full-blown trade war against China in 2018, slapped tariff on hundreds of billions of dollars on the Chinese goods. People were thinking that Biden coming would change, but Biden has not changed that policy. He is still continuing the economic war with China as Trump had decided. So there is a worry about decoupling between the two biggest economies of the world. And when the decoupling takes place, that will end the relationship that has been at the center of global growth for a decade. As I said earlier, so if India can jump in to the place where China is, that might save the situation to some extent. As a matter of fact, in a warning to the rest of the world, Japan may be just ahead of the curve. A developing economy like Japan before the 1980s and China before the 2020s can only industrialize once. Once you miss, you fail, you can't do it again. A sense of despondency sets in. Not only psychologically, but because of the reasons beyond your control. A lot of that. A graying workforce and low growth. These are the perils which afflicted Japan and afflict China. So this Japanification of China, as I call it, is a clear signal that all this talk of China being an economic giant, an economic tiger, was a hype, all sound and fury. Significant, I won't say nothing, something, but out of all proportions. Now, what's to be done? It's, as I said, ideal for India to jump in. No other country in the world can match what China has been doing. India only has or India can combine with countries like Vietnam, South Africa, and Philippines, and Israel to some extent. So the new quad can be made which can replace China, and that would be an ideal combination. But would it happen? I'm not very sanguine. Are you? But it's quite interesting to see that once the economic tigers come out to be limping jackals, and that's what happened in Japan, and that's what's happening in China. Thank you.